I passed out after the accident. My sister left me alone at the hospital and disappeared. 3 days later, she came back and asked the nurse if I was still not discharged yet. The nurse replied with one sentence that left my sister frozen in shock. Your sister was discharged 3 days ago, and she asked me to tell you that the dash camera you thought you removed actually syncs directly to her secure cloud. At that exact moment, my sister felt her phone buzz. It was a text from her husband, Jamal. The message read that the job was done and $4 million had just been transferred from my personal trust fund into his offshore bank account. They thought they had won. My name is Nora. I am 33 years old and I work as an independent forensic accountant. While my family constantly mocks me as a glorified coin counter, they have no idea that I spend my days tracking down federal financial fraud. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had a toxic family member completely underestimate your intelligence. The betrayal started exactly 3 days earlier on a stormy drive back to the Chicago suburbs. The rain was pouring heavily on the dark interstate. My sister Audrey had downed 4 strong martinis at our parents' anniversary dinner. Despite barely being able to stand, she loudly demanded that I pull over and let her drive my car. When I firmly refused, she started screaming that I was a pathetic failure who always tried to ruin her perfect image. I kept my eyes focused on the slick road and gripped the steering wheel tighter. Audrey was 36 years old, but still threw vicious tantrums. Our parents had always treated her as the flawless golden child while I was treated as the ultimate scapegoat. "You think you are so superior with your little numbers game?" she slurred loudly as she unbuckled her seatbelt. She leaned her entire body over the center console, smelling heavily of expensive gin and bitter resentment. "Give me the wheel right now, Nora." I firmly told her to sit back down, but she refused to listen. She lunged forward with zero warning. Her hands grabbed the top of my steering wheel and yanked it violently to the right. The tires instantly lost their grip on the wet asphalt. I slammed on the brakes, but the momentum was unstoppable. The heavy vehicle spun wildly across 3 lanes of highway traffic. The very last thing I saw before the airbags forcefully deployed was the massive concrete barrier rushing directly toward my windshield. The brutal impact shattered the glass and sent a deafening crack ringing through my skull. Blinding pain exploded behind my eyes as my vision quickly faded to black. But right before I completely lost consciousness, I felt her hands moving over my body. She was not checking my pulse to see if I was alive. She was frantically digging into my coat pocket. She was not calling emergency services to save my life. She was intentionally pulling out the secure encrypted memory drive that my grandfather had left exclusively for me. It was the drive holding the access keys to my $4 million inheritance. I heard the passenger door forcefully kick open. The sound of her boots clicking on the wet pavement quickly faded into the stormy night. She left me trapped and bleeding out inside the crushed metal frame of my car, just so she could steal my future. The metallic crunch echoed in my ears long after the car finally stopped spinning. Thick white smoke from the deployed airbags filled the cabin, mixing with the sharp smell of burnt rubber and leaking coolant. I was slumped against the driver's side door, my head throbbing with an agonizing pain that made it impossible to keep my eyes fully open. Through the hazy smoke, I could hear Audrey coughing frantically. She was completely unharmed. The passenger side had barely taken a scratch, while my side had absorbed the entire brutal impact of the concrete barrier. I tried to whisper her name to ask for help, but the words caught in my throat. I expected her to pull out her phone and immediately dial emergency services to save my life. I expected my older sister to check if I was even breathing. Instead, I heard her muttering curses under her breath. She kicked her door open and stumbled outside, pacing in the freezing rain. She was panicking about her career and the fact that she was heavily intoxicated. If the police realized she caused this crash, she would lose her corporate director job and her pristine golden child reputation. She walked around the front of the crushed hood and yanked my door open. The icy wind hit my face, but the cold was nothing compared to what she did next. She grabbed the half-empty bottle of expensive gin from the floorboard and poured it directly over my winter coat. The strong stench of alcohol soaked into my clothes and hair. She was intentionally framing me for the crash she had caused. She wanted the police to find me unconscious behind the wheel, reeking of liquor, so they would easily conclude that I was the one driving drunk. As I lay there gasping for air, my vision narrowing into a dark tunnel, her hands started frantically tearing through my leather tote bag. She dumped the contents onto the passenger seat. My wallet, my keys, and my documents scattered everywhere in the dark. She ignored all of it. She was looking for one specific thing. Her fingers finally closed around the heavy metal casing of the encrypted flash drive. That drive held the exclusive access credentials to the trust fund our grandfather had set up entirely in my name. He knew how greedy our family was and he wanted to protect me. Now Audrey had the key to $4 million. She looked down at me one last time. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a cold, calculated determination to save herself. She zipped her designer jacket, stepped back into the stormy night, and slammed my car door shut. She walked away down the dark highway, leaving her younger sister trapped in the wreckage to take the blame and potentially bleed to death. The deep isolation of that moment burned away any remaining love I had for her. As the distant sound of police sirens finally pierced the night air, I made a silent promise to myself that this would be the last time she ever treated me like collateral damage. I woke up to the harsh glare of fluorescent lights and the steady beeping of a heart monitor. The sharp pain in my head had settled into a dull, heavy ache. As I tried to sit up, a young doctor walked into the room holding a clipboard. He looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and quiet judgment. He told me I had a mild concussion and a fractured rib from the steering wheel impact. Then his tone grew noticeably colder. He informed me that 2 police officers were waiting in the hallway to speak with me. The paramedics had found me unconscious in the driver's seat, soaking wet and reeking of expensive gin. The authorities were officially preparing to charge me with driving under the influence and reckless endangerment. I did not gasp or cry. I did not immediately start screaming about my innocence to the doctor. My mind was already analyzing the situation with the cold, calculated precision of a forensic accountant. I knew that panicking would only make me look completely guilty. I politely thanked the doctor for his medical help and asked if the paramedics had recovered my personal belongings from the crash site. He nodded and pointed to a clear plastic hospital bag resting on the small table near my bed. Inside was my ruined leather tote bag. I slowly reached over and pulled the bag onto my lap. My hands moved methodically through the chaotic contents. My leather wallet was still there. My house keys were still there. My mobile phone with a badly cracked screen was resting at the bottom. But the heavy metal flash drive was completely gone. The physical encryption key to my $4 million inheritance had vanished into thin air. Any normal person would have broken down in tears or frantically called the police to report a massive theft. But I just leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows and smiled. It was a small, chilling smile that would have terrified my sister if she had been there to see it. Audrey had always severely underestimated my intelligence. She saw me as a boring number cruncher who sat behind a dusty desk all day long. She had no idea what my career actually entailed. I did not just count loose change for small businesses. I tracked down highly sophisticated financial criminals who tried to hide millions of dollars across international borders. I spent my long workdays setting complex digital traps for criminals who were much smarter and much more dangerous than my spoiled older sister. She genuinely thought she had committed the absolute perfect crime. She thought she could just take the flash drive, plug it into a computer, and walk away with my grandfather's hard-earned money, while I took the fall for her terrible drunk driving. What Audrey did not realize was that I never left my most valuable digital assets unprotected. The flash drive she stole was not just a simple storage device, it was active bait. I knew exactly how greedy my family was, and I had been waiting patiently for them to make a careless move. Now she had taken the bait, and she was about to drag her arrogant husband Jamal right into my trap. I picked up my cracked mobile phone from the bottom of the plastic hospital bag. The glass screen was heavily splintered and cut my thumb, but the device was still functioning. I dialed my parents' home number. I knew I needed to make this phone call not because I expected any actual sympathy, but because I needed absolute confirmation that they were entirely complicit in their own emotional detachment. I needed to know there was nothing left to save. The phone rang 3 times before my mother Helen finally answered the call. Loud, cheerful voices and upbeat jazz music echoed clearly in the background. I kept my voice calm and steady as I told her that I was currently lying in a bed at Chicago Medical Center. I explained that I had been in a severe car crash on the interstate and that the local police were waiting outside my room to question me. A normal mother would have dropped everything in absolute terror. A normal mother would have rushed to the emergency room immediately to see if her child was alive. But Helen just let out a loud, heavy sigh of extreme annoyance. Her tone was sharp and filled with pure irritation, as if my near-death experience was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to her busy schedule. She asked me if I had completely ruined the vehicle. That was her very first question. She did not ask if my ribs were broken. She did not ask if my head was bleeding. She only cared about the property damage and how it might look to the neighbors. When I honestly told her the car was completely totaled, she clicked her tongue in deep disgust. She sharply ordered me to keep my mouth shut and not to drag my sister Audrey into this mess. She reminded me that Audrey was heavily focused on her corporate career and could not afford any negative distractions. Then she delivered the final blow that completely severed any remaining emotional ties I had to that toxic house. Helen firmly told me she simply did not have time to deal with my attention-seeking drama today. She proudly announced that she and my father were extremely busy preparing a massive backyard barbecue to celebrate my brother-in-law Jamal. She excitedly boasted that Jamal had just secured a groundbreaking $4 million investment deal for his private wealth fund, and the entire family was gathering to toast his incredible financial genius. She casually told me to deal with the police officers on my own, take a taxi home whenever I was done, and make sure I did not bring my depressing energy to their festive party. Then the line went completely dead. She hung up on her injured, hospitalized daughter without a single second thought. I sat there listening to the blank dial tone. $4 million. The exact amount stored inside the trust fund drive that Audrey had just stolen from my bleeding body. Any tiny fraction of guilt I might have felt about destroying them was completely gone now. While I sat in the sterile hospital room miles away, my stolen flash drive was already sitting on my parents' expensive mahogany dining table. My brother-in-law Jamal was aggressively tapping his fingers against his high-end laptop. He had just plugged the heavy metal drive into his computer and was eagerly waiting for the contents to load. Audrey stood right behind him, still wearing the same clothes that smelled heavily of the gin she had poured all over me. She nervously bit her fingernails as Jamal confidently smirked at the glowing screen. He was completely convinced that he was the smartest person in the entire room. "Look at this pathetic security setup." Jamal laughed loudly, his deep voice echoing through the massive house. He leaned back in his leather chair and shook his head in pure amusement. "Your sister actually thinks she is some kind of financial genius just because she looks at boring spreadsheets all day. She is nothing but a glorified coin counter for small retail shops. Did she really think a standard commercial encryption blocker would stop a professional investment director like me? I deal with millions of dollars every single day. Her little piggy bank is amateur work." Audrey let out a long breath of relief and crossed her arms tightly. She told Jamal to hurry up and secure the $4 million before the police called them about my car crash. She was completely ruthless and devoid of any empathy. Her only concern was getting her hands on my inheritance to fund her lavish lifestyle and pay off the massive secret debts Jamal had recently accumulated from his failed business ventures. Jamal confidently cracked his knuckles and opened a highly illegal software program he had purchased on the dark web months ago. He had been heavily involved in shady offshore investments for years, and he thought he knew absolutely everything about bypassing digital financial security protocols. He quickly ran a sophisticated digital signature forgery tool against the drive. He firmly believed he was forcibly breaking down my security walls and taking complete control of my trust fund. He typed rapidly on his keyboard, bypassing what he assumed were my basic firewall protections. He laughed again as the screen suddenly flashed green, indicating that the primary lock had been successfully removed. He loudly bragged to Audrey that breaking into my system was like taking candy from a helpless child. He even joked about how they were going to spend my money on a new luxury sports car by the end of the week. He thought he was hacking me. He thought he had easily outsmarted the pathetic little sister, who nobody in the family ever respected or valued. What Jamal absolutely failed to understand was that the green light on his screen was not a sign of his hacking brilliance. It was the digital front door swinging wide open because I had intentionally unlocked it for him. He was completely blind to the fact that his illegal software was not breaking my security at all. It was simply triggering the silent alarms I had carefully coded into the core of the drive. He was eagerly stepping right into the center of my trap with a giant smile on his face. I sat up slowly on the stiff hospital bed, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from my fractured rib. The police officers had finally left my room after taking my official statement. They were completely convinced that I was just another tragic victim of my own reckless drunk driving. I let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe. Once the heavy wooden door clicked shut, I reached over to my personal overnight bag that the paramedics had brought in from the crash site. Hidden deep inside a secret zipper compartment at the very bottom was my secondary secure laptop. I carefully placed the sleek black device on my lap and powered it on. The screen instantly glowed to life, casting a pale blue light across the dark, sterile hospital room. I did not need my stolen encrypted flash drive to access my own financial network. That physical drive was nothing more than a carefully designed piece of bait. My real command system was entirely cloud-based and secured behind multiple layers of biometric authentication. I placed my thumb on the digital scanner and looked directly into the camera lens. The software recognized me immediately and granted me full administrative access to my remote servers. I opened my customized remote monitoring dashboard and leaned back against the stiff pillows. The tracking software I had personally developed was specifically designed to hunt down highly sophisticated international financial criminals. It was absolute overkill for an arrogant amateur like my brother-in-law Jamal. On my screen, I could see a perfect live feed of his current digital activity. He had connected my stolen flash drive to his personal computer on my parents' home network. He was so completely overconfident in his own abilities that he did not even bother to use a basic virtual private network to hide his digital footprint. I watched the screen intently as his cursor moved across the digital interface. I could see every single keystroke he made in real time. I watched him proudly open his illegal forgery software and type in the commands to bypass my fake security walls. He actually thought he was brilliantly hacking into my trust fund. He had no idea that my encrypted drive was secretly taking full control of his computer the exact second he plugged it into his device. My system was currently working in the background, downloading his entire hard drive, copying his private emails, his secret offshore bank accounts, and every single piece of illegal financial evidence he had ever tried to hide. A cold, satisfying smirk slowly spread across my face as I watched his cursor click the final confirmation button on his screen. He thought he had just successfully secured $4 million for himself and my sister. But in reality, he had just authorized my security system to completely hijack his entire digital identity. Jamal had always treated me like I was completely invisible and entirely worthless. Now I was sitting silently in a hospital bed miles away, watching him blindly walk right into a federal trap that would permanently destroy his entire life. The game was finally set in motion, and there was absolutely no way he could stop it. I stared at the glowing dashboard of my secure laptop. Jamal was arrogantly typing away on his keyboard miles away, thinking he was a master hacker. He had successfully bypassed the first security layer, which was nothing more than a digital welcome mat I had left out for him. Now he was staring directly at the secondary firewall. This was the final barrier protecting the $4 million trust fund. I knew his cheap illegal software from the dark web would never be able to break through this advanced encryption on its own. He would eventually fail and give up trying. I could not let that happen. I needed him to commit the crime completely, so there would be absolutely no escaping the severe federal charges. I calmly moved my thumb across the trackpad and hovered my cursor over the master control switch. With one single deliberate click, I manually disabled the secondary firewall right from my hospital bed. I watched the live feed of his screen as the red warning symbols suddenly disappeared. A bright green notification popped up on his end, cheerfully announcing that full administrative access had been granted. On my end, however, a very different message flashed across my dark screen in bold red letters. The system confirmed that the Federal Financial Trap Protocol was now fully activated and actively recording. Jamal let out a loud, triumphant laugh that I could almost hear through the monitor. He rapidly clicked into the main account ledger. There it was, sitting perfectly in the center of his screen. $4 million in cleared available funds just waiting to be taken. He wasted absolutely no time. He immediately opened the international wire transfer portal and began typing in the complicated routing numbers for his hidden offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. He was so blinded by his own intense greed and massive ego that he did not even pause to verify the encrypted destination path. He firmly believed he was permanently stealing my inheritance to pay off his massive secret debts and buy my parents their dream luxury boat. He confidently moved his mouse over the final execute button. He did not hesitate for a single second. He clicked confirm. My secure system instantly recorded his forged digital signature, his exact physical location, and the precise timestamp of the illegal transaction. The money instantly vanished from the trust fund interface, leaving a completely empty zero balance on his screen. Jamal leaned back in his chair and started celebrating with Audrey, completely unaware of the massive mistake he had actually just made. He thought he had successfully transferred the stolen funds to his offshore account, where nobody could ever touch it. He did not know that my hidden protocol had automatically intercepted the transfer and secretly rerouted every single penny directly into a frozen evidence account, controlled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The steel trap had violently snapped shut. He had just committed federal felony wire fraud from his own home network, and I finally had all the absolute proof I needed to destroy their perfect lives forever. I discharged myself from the hospital the next morning with a thick white bandage wrapped tightly around my forehead and a painful dull ache in my ribs. I did not call my parents to pick me up. I simply ordered an Uber and watched the familiar suburban streets of Chicago roll by through the car window. The driver kept glancing at my bruised face in the rearview mirror with clear concern, but I just stared blankly ahead. My mind was completely focused on the digital trap I had just set and the absolute destruction that was about to rain down on my family. The car pulled up to my parents' large colonial house, and I slowly stepped out onto the pristine concrete driveway. Before I even reached the front door, I could hear the loud thumping bass of upbeat jazz music and the roaring laughter of a large crowd. My parents had spared absolutely no expense for Jamal and his supposed $4 million financial triumph. The front lawn was lined with expensive luxury cars belonging to my parents' wealthy friends and pretentious neighbors. I pushed open the heavy wooden side gate and walked into the expansive backyard. The warm afternoon air smelled of expensive grilled meats and rich cigars. The massive stone patio was decorated with elegant string lights and huge floral centerpieces. It looked like a lavish wedding reception rather than a casual afternoon barbecue. I stood quietly at the edge of the manicured lawn, watching the people I called family openly celebrate the brutal theft of my inheritance. Dozens of guests were holding crystal champagne glasses and laughing loudly under the bright sun. I walked slowly through the busy crowd, my dark winter coat still faintly smelling of the sterile hospital room and the bitter gin Audrey had poured all over me the night before. Several guests briefly glanced at my heavily bandaged head and pale, bruised face, but they quickly looked away. They clearly did not want to ruin their festive, upbeat mood with my depressing reality. Absolutely nobody rushed over to ask if I was okay. Nobody offered me a comfortable chair or even a simple glass of water. I looked across the yard and finally spotted my parents standing near the massive outdoor kitchen area. My mother Helen was wearing a brand new designer summer dress, holding a silver tray of gourmet appetizers with a massive fake smile on her face. My father Richard was standing right next to her, loudly boasting to his wealthy golf buddies about his brilliant and successful son-in-law. They looked so incredibly proud and completely oblivious to the massive federal crime that had just been committed inside their own home. I took a deep breath, pushing through the sharp, stabbing pain in my fractured rib, and walked directly toward them. I was completely ready to play my part in their grand celebration and watch them dig their own graves right there in the beautiful backyard. My father Richard was in the middle of a loud joke when he finally turned and saw me standing there. The massive fake smile on his face vanished the second his eyes landed on my bandaged head and bruised face. He did not drop his expensive glass of wine in shock. He did not rush over to pull me into a warm hug or ask if I was severely injured. Instead, his face twisted into a mask of pure irritation and deep embarrassment. He quickly whispered an apology to his wealthy friends and marched directly toward me with heavy, angry steps. He grabbed my upper arm roughly and yanked me behind a large stone pillar, completely out of sight from the rest of the party guests. The sudden violent movement sent a blinding spike of pain straight through my fractured rib, but I bit the inside of my cheek and refused to make a single sound. As soon as we were hidden from the crowd, he leaned in close and aggressively hissed at me. He demanded to know what on earth I was thinking driving my car completely drunk and destroying it like a reckless, careless loser. He fully believed the fake police report and my sister's vicious lies without a single ounce of doubt. He angrily complained that the news of my stupid accident was going to completely humiliate the family and make all their country club friends gossip about us. He pointed his finger directly in my face and coldly told me that I was a massive disappointment who always tried to ruin everyone else's happiness just to get some pathetic attention. He relentlessly reminded me that today was supposed to be a flawless celebration honoring Jamal and his incredible $4 million investment triumph. He explicitly ordered me not to drag my pathetic bruised body around the party and ruin the festive mood they had spent thousands of dollars to create. Every single word that came out of his mouth was strictly about his own public image and the fake success of his favorite son-in-law. There was absolutely no concern for the fact that his own daughter had nearly died alone on a freezing highway just a few nights ago. I stood completely still and stared straight into his furious eyes. The cold, harsh reality of his extreme selfishness permanently killed any lingering emotional attachment I had to him. I wondered how quickly his aggressive tone would change if he knew that the $4 million he was so fiercely protecting was actually my stolen inheritance. I did not shed a single tear or try to defend myself against his cruel accusations. I simply offered him a tight, hollow smile, nodded my head slowly, and took a step back, mentally preparing myself for the absolute destruction I was about to unleash on his perfect afternoon. I stepped out from the cold shadow of the stone pillar and quietly blended back into the edge of the crowd. Just as my father rushed back to join my mother, a loud clinking sound echoed across the patio. Jamal was standing confidently on the raised wooden deck near the swimming pool, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The upbeat jazz music was quickly muted, and the dozens of wealthy guests immediately turned their attention to the man of the hour. Jamal smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and flashed a blindingly arrogant smile. He looked completely intoxicated by his own fake success. He loudly thanked everyone for coming to celebrate what he called the absolute greatest milestone of his entire professional career. With a dramatic, arrogant pause, he announced that his private wealth fund had just officially secured a massive $4 million capital injection. He proudly claimed to the crowd that the funds came from a highly exclusive anonymous international partner who had personally sought him out. According to Jamal, this mysterious wealthy investor had been completely blown away by his unmatched financial genius and his unparalleled market strategies. The crowd quickly erupted into loud applause and excited murmurs, while I stood in the back simply watching him blatantly lie to everyone he knew. Jamal raised his free hand to quiet the cheering guests because he was not entirely finished showing off. He turned his smug gaze directly toward my parents, who were standing in the very front row, looking up at him with pure, unhidden adoration. He announced that because family was the absolute most important thing in the world to him, he wanted to share his incredible newfound wealth with the people who supported him. He pointed his glass straight at my father and loudly promised to buy him the luxury retirement yacht he had always dreamed of owning. He even boasted that he would officially name the expensive boat after my mother. Helen let out a loud, dramatic gasp and pressed her hands against her chest as if she might faint from pure joy. She pushed through the clapping guests and threw her arms around Jamal, hugging him tightly. My father quickly joined them, patting Jamal heavily on the back and proudly declaring to the entire party that Jamal was the absolute best thing that had ever happened to their family. They loudly praised his incredible work ethic, his brilliant mind, and his unmatched generosity. They were practically worshipping the ground he walked on. It was a truly sickening display of blind favoritism. My parents were openly treating a dangerous financial criminal like a god, while their actual blood daughter stood just a few feet away, recovering from a brutal accident his wife had caused. I crossed my arms over my chest and carefully protected my fractured rib. I did not interrupt his glorious speech. I simply watched him bask in the fake glory of his stolen $4 million. Every single arrogant word leaving his mouth was just another heavy nail he was happily hammering into his own coffin. As the loud applause for Jamal finally began to fade into the background, my sister Audrey suddenly noticed me standing near the edge of the stone patio. She aggressively pushed her way through the crowd of wealthy guests and marched straight toward me. She was wearing a stunning silk designer dress, and her hair was perfectly styled. She looked absolutely flawless, which was a sharp contrast to the thick medical bandages wrapped around my throbbing head. She did not look guilty or remorseful about leaving me to bleed in a crushed car just a few nights ago. Instead, she looked completely annoyed by my physical presence. Audrey stopped right in front of me and quickly unclasped her expensive leather handbag. She aggressively pulled out a folded piece of crisp white paper and a printed bank check. Without saying a single word of greeting, she threw the check directly at my face. The small piece of paper fluttered through the air and landed quietly on the green grass near my shoes. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and coldly informed me that the check was for $10,000. She told me to take the pathetic handout to buy myself a cheap used car and pay off my ridiculous hospital bills. She acted as if she was doing me a massive charitable favor by throwing her spare change at my feet, but there was a massive catch to her fake generosity. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at the folded white document she was still holding in her other hand. She sharply ordered me to take a pen from her purse and sign the paper immediately. She confidently explained that the document was a formal written confession specifically drafted by her personal lawyer. The paper explicitly stated that I was the one operating the vehicle under the influence of heavy alcohol, and that I took absolute full legal responsibility for the devastating highway crash. She wanted me to permanently cement her vicious lie into a binding legal record. Audrey leaned in incredibly close, so nobody else at the party could hear her toxic threats. She arrogantly whispered that if I refused to sign the confession right then and there, she and Jamal would make sure my parents completely disowned me forever. She confidently smirked and told me to stop being a dramatic burden. She demanded I sign the paper so they could all go back to enjoying their beautiful afternoon without my depressing energy ruining their aesthetic. She honestly thought she held all the power and that I would instantly bow down to her demands, just like I always did when we were younger. I looked down at the $10,000 check resting on the grass and then back up at her smug face. The sheer audacity of her actions was truly mind-blowing. She and her husband had just stolen $4 million of my actual inheritance, and now she was trying to use a microscopic fraction of my own money to bribe me into accepting a severe criminal record. I did not reach for the pen she was holding out to me. I simply stared at her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Before I could even respond to Audrey, my mother Helen suddenly materialized right beside us. She had noticed the tense interaction from across the patio and hurried over, but not to defuse the situation or protect her injured daughter. She stood firmly shoulder to shoulder with Audrey, presenting a united front against me. Helen looked down at the $10,000 check resting on the grass and let out a heavy sigh of extreme annoyance. She aggressively crossed her arms and glared at me with pure disdain. Helen sharply whispered that I needed to stop being so incredibly stubborn and selfish. She firmly told me to pick up the pen and sign the legal confession right this second. She passionately argued that Audrey was currently on the fast track to becoming a senior corporate vice president, and that a scandalous police investigation would completely ruin her flawless professional reputation. According to my mother, Audrey had a bright, beautiful future ahead of her, while I was just a lowly, freelance accountant who had absolutely nothing to lose by taking the blame. She actually looked me in the eye and said a criminal record would not really affect someone in my boring tax profession. The sheer cruelty of her words hung heavily in the warm afternoon air. My own mother was actively coercing me into accepting a severe felony charge just to protect the daughter she actually loved. Helen did not stop there. She leaned closer, her voice dripping with pure venom, and told me that $10,000 was more than enough money for me to pack up all my belongings and finally move far away. She made it painfully clear that with Jamal bringing in $4 million today, my presence was no longer required or desired in their wealthy new reality. They were stepping into high society, and I was just an embarrassing stain on their perfect image. She explicitly ordered me to take the bribe, sign my life away, and disappear from their perfect family portrait. She claimed that my constant failure was a heavy burden on them, and that they deserved to enjoy this luxurious lifestyle without me dragging them down. She even had the audacity to suggest that I should be extremely grateful they were offering me any money at all, considering how badly I had embarrassed them by showing up to the upscale party covered in medical bandages. Helen coldly stated that if I did not sign the document immediately, she would personally ensure that I was entirely cut out of the family forever. I stood completely silent, absorbing the absolute magnitude of their betrayal. My mother and my sister were perfectly willing to let me face prison time for a catastrophic drunk driving crash I did not cause, just so they could maintain their fake high society status. They honestly believed that their toxic manipulation was working exactly like it always did in the past. They thought I was just going to quietly bow my head, accept the blame, and walk away with their pathetic hush money. They had absolutely no idea that I was not the helpless scapegoat anymore. I looked down at the $10,000 check lying on the bright green grass. Then I looked at the printed legal confession still tightly clutched in Audrey's hand. My mother Helen and my sister Audrey were both watching me with smug, expectant expressions. They were entirely convinced that I was about to break down, apologize, and submit to their cruel demands, just like I had done my entire life. Instead, I slowly bent down and picked up the crisp bank check. Audrey smiled triumphantly, thinking she had easily won the battle. But I did not reach for the pen she was holding. I firmly gripped the edges of the check and ripped it cleanly in half. The sharp sound of tearing paper seemed to cut right through the soft jazz music playing in the background. Audrey gasped as I stacked the two halves together and tore them again and again until the expensive bribe was nothing but tiny pieces of worthless paper. I casually opened my hand and let the shredded pieces flutter down onto my mother's pristine designer shoes. Helen let out a loud, furious shriek, and Audrey immediately started screaming that I was an ungrateful, psychotic failure, but I completely tuned them out. I had absolutely no interest in engaging with their petty high school bullying anymore. My eyes were already locked directly on my brother-in-law, Jamal. Jamal was still standing near the edge of the wooden deck, happily sipping his champagne and soaking in the admiration of the wealthy party guests. I walked straight past my furious mother and my screaming sister, stepping right into Jamal's personal space. He looked down at my bandaged head with a highly amused, arrogant smirk, clearly wondering why the pathetic family scapegoat was daring to interrupt his glorious victory lap. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I kept my tone perfectly calm and professionally cold as I delivered the first devastating blow. I loudly congratulated him on his massive $4 million success. Then I tilted my head slightly and asked him how exactly his private wealth fund was planning to bypass the brand new IRS compliance regulations regarding high-volume wire transfers into offshore bank accounts. I specifically asked him how his anonymous investor was handling the intense federal tax scrutiny currently surrounding hidden shell corporations based strictly in the Cayman Islands. The arrogant smirk on Jamal's face was instantly wiped away, as if I had physically slapped him across the jaw. His large hand involuntarily trembled, causing a splash of expensive champagne to spill over the edge of his crystal glass and stain the lapel of his custom-tailored suit. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes in absolute stunned silence. He had told the entire party that the money came from a mysterious international partner. He had never once mentioned the Cayman Islands or offshore accounts to anyone in this family. The confident financial mastermind who thought he had flawlessly stolen my inheritance was suddenly sweating profusely under the bright afternoon sun. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but his throat was completely paralyzed by sudden, overwhelming panic. Jamal stood there, completely frozen, unable to form a single coherent sentence. His sudden, terrified silence should have been a massive red flag to anyone paying attention. But my parents were entirely blinded by their own desperate need to protect their golden son-in-law. Before Jamal could even attempt to stutter out a pathetic excuse, my father Richard aggressively stepped right between us. He puffed out his chest and physically shielded the grown man who had just committed a massive federal financial crime under his own roof. Richard pointed a heavy finger directly at my face and loudly ordered me to back away from Jamal. His voice echoed across the quiet patio, drawing the attention of even more wealthy guests. He furiously accused me of being completely consumed by toxic jealousy. He told the entire crowd that I was just a bitter, lonely woman who could not stand to see anyone else achieve real success. He actually laughed in my face and asked how a low-level freelance accountant could ever possibly understand the highly complex world of international wealth management. He loudly mocked my career, calling me a glorified cashier who only knew how to balance basic spreadsheets for failing small businesses. He demanded to know who gave me the right to interrogate a brilliant investment director about federal tax laws when I could barely even manage my own pathetic life. He completely dismissed my highly accurate financial question as nothing more than desperate, uneducated rambling designed to ruin a perfect afternoon. My mother, Helen, was quick to join the vicious attack. She marched over and stood firmly next to my father, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She looked at the medical bandages wrapped around my head and loudly announced to the whispering guests that my terrible car crash must have caused severe brain damage. She claimed I was acting completely unhinged and deliberately trying to sabotage a beautiful family celebration just to steal the spotlight from Audrey and Jamal. She aggressively told me that Jamal dealt with elite global markets every single day and that his anonymous investor was completely beyond my limited mental comprehension. She fiercely defended his honor completely, unaware that the man she was protecting had just maliciously drained my grandfather's trust fund to save himself from total financial ruin. Seeing my parents aggressively attack me gave Jamal just enough time to swallow his rising panic. He wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead and quickly adjusted his stained suit jacket. He let out a loud, forced laugh and nodded in agreement with my parents. He arrogantly told the crowd that my little tax question was adorable, but completely irrelevant to his highly sophisticated investment strategies. They all thought they had successfully put me back in my place. They thought their loud insults had permanently shut me down. But their blind, arrogant loyalty was exactly what I was counting on. I let their cruel laughter wash over me without blinking a single eye. My father was still aggressively pointing his finger at my face, and my mother was still shaking her head in deep disgust. Jamal had regained his arrogant posture and took another long sip of his expensive champagne, completely convinced that he had successfully dodged my financial interrogation. The wealthy party guests who had gathered around to watch the family drama were starting to lose interest and turn back to their gourmet appetizers. The entire scene was a perfect picture of suburban delusion. They all honestly believed that my silence was a sign of total defeat. I slowly lowered my hands and reached deep into the inside pocket of my dark winter coat. My fingers brushed against the crisp edges of a thick formal document I had retrieved from their front porch mailbox just moments before walking into the backyard. I pulled it out and held it up into the bright afternoon sunlight. It was a heavy white envelope sealed with a massive bright red stamp from the Primary National Bank that held the mortgage to their beautiful colonial home. The striking red ink immediately caught my mother's attention, causing her cruel, mocking smile to freeze completely on her face. I kept my voice perfectly even and projecting clearly enough for the front row of wealthy guests to hear every single word. I looked directly at my father and calmly asked him if he had bothered to read his morning mail before throwing this lavish $4 million celebration. I asked him if he had seen the final certified warning that the bank had just delivered to his front door. Richard slowly lowered his pointing finger and stared at the envelope with a sudden look of deep confusion. He defensively snapped at me, demanding to know why I was touching his private mail and what nonsense I was talking about. I took one step closer to him and tapped the red stamp with my index finger. I loudly informed my parents that the envelope contained a final notice of absolute property foreclosure. I clearly stated that according to the verified document, the bank was officially seizing the massive estate we were currently standing on. I told them that the property mortgage had been heavily defaulted on for 24 consecutive months, and that the local sheriff department was officially scheduled to arrive at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to permanently padlock the front doors and evict them from the premises. The upbeat jazz music suddenly felt completely inappropriate as a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the expensive stone patio. The wealthy country club friends who were just praising my parents a minute ago began whispering loudly among themselves, exchanging shocked and judgmental glances. The crystal champagne glass in my father's hand began to tremble uncontrollably, splashing wine onto his expensive leather shoes. Helen let out a tiny breathless gasp and looked frantically back and forth between the red-stamped envelope and her golden son-in-law. Jamal stood completely frozen, his face turning a sickly ash gray. The glorious illusion of their high society wealth had just been brutally shattered in front of their most important friends, and the real nightmare was only just beginning. I unfolded the thick white paper with slow, deliberate movements. The rustling sound seemed incredibly loud in the dead silence of the backyard. My father, Richard, stood frozen with wine soaking into his expensive shoes, while my mother, Helen, stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. I cleared my throat and began reading the formal legal text in a loud, clear voice, ensuring that every single wealthy guest on the patio could hear the absolute truth. I read the official header identifying the primary national bank and the specific residential address of the massive colonial estate we were currently standing on. I did not rush through the heavy legal words. I let every single syllable sink into the quiet afternoon air. I read the section detailing how a massive secondary mortgage had been secretly taken out against the property exactly 24 months ago. I looked up for a brief second to see the blood completely drain from my father's face. He had absolutely no idea that his beautiful home had been heavily leveraged and used as high-risk financial collateral. I continued reading the exact financial figures printed on the page. The document explicitly stated that the massive monthly loan payments had been completely ignored for 2 solid years, accumulating a staggering amount of hidden debt and severe banking penalties. The financial institution had exhausted all standard collection attempts and final warnings. I raised my voice slightly as I reached the final and most devastating paragraph of the formal foreclosure notice. I announced to the entire listening crowd that all legal grace periods had officially expired as of yesterday evening. I read the final sentence with perfect clarity. It stated that the local county sheriff department alongside the legal bank representatives would arrive at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to execute a mandatory eviction protocol. They were coming to change all the exterior locks, seize any remaining physical assets inside the house, and permanently board up the front doors. My parents had less than 24 hours to pack up their entire lives before they were forcibly thrown out onto the street. The silver tray of gourmet appetizers slipped right out of my mother's hands and crashed violently onto the stone patio. Expensive caviar and delicate pastries scattered across the hard ground, but she did not even blink. She stood completely paralyzed, staring at the red-stamped paper with wide, terrified eyes. Her perfect high society facade was instantly shattered into a million unfixable pieces. My father tried to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped his throat. He looked desperately at the wealthy country club friends he had spent decades trying to impress. But those supposed loyal friends were already physically taking a step backward. In their elite social circle, sudden poverty was treated like a highly contagious disease. They were whispering furiously among themselves, judging my parents for their fake wealth and massive public humiliation. Richard looked back at me, his face pale and his hands shaking violently. He finally found his voice and frantically stammered that the letter had to be a cruel joke because he had never signed any secondary mortgage papers in his entire life. Before my father could completely spiral into a massive panic attack, Jamal aggressively stepped forward and positioned himself right in the center of the patio. He let out a loud, condescending chuckle that echoed awkwardly through the silent crowd. He smoothly adjusted his expensive silk tie and held up his hands in a calming gesture as if he were addressing a room full of easily confused children. He looked directly at my terrified parents and told them to take a deep breath because the situation was absolutely nothing to worry about. He confidently declared that the frightening document I had just read was simply a standard automated clerical notice generated by an outdated banking algorithm. Jamal began throwing out highly complex financial terminology at rapid speed, deliberately trying to confuse everyone listening. He loudly discussed collateralized debt obligations, temporary escrow misallocations, and strategic asset leveraging. He claimed that the massive secondary mortgage was actually an advanced bridge loan restructuring tactic he had personally arranged to legally protect their estate from aggressive inflation rates. According to his completely fabricated explanation, the bank was required by federal law to send out these aggressive template letters whenever a high-yield portfolio was being actively transitioned into a new global wealth management trust. He spoke with such absolute conviction and unwavering authority that you could almost see the desperate relief starting to wash over my parents' faces. They wanted so badly to believe his lies because the alternative was facing total immediate financial ruin. The wealthy country club friends who were whispering a moment ago slowly began to nod along, easily swayed by his confident tone and expensive suit. They were eager to return to their champagne and forget the awkward interruption. Jamal then turned his aggressive focus entirely onto me. He shook his head in mock pity and told the guests that this was exactly why freelance bookkeepers should never try to analyze high-level corporate finance. He loudly mocked my reading comprehension, stating that I had completely misinterpreted a basic regulatory compliance letter and twisted it into a dramatic eviction story. He accused me of purposely stealing my parents' private mail just to stage a malicious public stunt because I was furiously jealous of his massive $4 million success. He called me a desperate amateur who was only trying to drag her successful family down into the mud. He looked deeply into my father's eyes and placed a reassuring hand on his trembling shoulder. He confidently promised Richard that there was absolutely no foreclosure happening tomorrow morning. He swore that the supposed debt was already fully covered by the massive capital injection he had secured today, and the bank would clear the administrative error by Monday. He smiled charmingly at the crowd and apologized for his unstable sister-in-law, claiming my recent head injury must have severely impaired my logical reasoning. He was desperately trying to bury the truth under a mountain of heavy financial jargon and arrogant gaslighting, but I was completely ready to tear his fake defense apart piece by piece. I let Jamal finish his arrogant speech. I stood perfectly still and let him bask in the temporary relief of my parents and the wealthy guests. He really thought throwing around a few buzzwords he memorized from a daytime television show would be enough to intimidate a federal forensic accountant. I slowly shook my head and pulled a second, much thicker stack of folded papers from my other coat pocket. I looked directly into his sweating face and began completely dismantling his pathetic defense. I loudly clarified to the listening crowd that a bridge loan restructuring tactic does not result in a 24-month consecutive delinquency notice on a primary residential mortgage. I explained that temporary escrow misallocation is a completely fabricated phrase that does not exist anywhere in real federal banking regulations. I told him his financial vocabulary was just as fake and incredibly empty as his supposed offshore investment portfolio. The smug smile on Jamal's face finally started to crack and fall apart. He took a nervous step back, but I took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between us. I held up the thick stack of detailed bank statements and certified legal filings for everyone on the patio to see. I turned to my father, Richard, and told him that he was actually absolutely right about one specific thing. He never signed any secondary mortgage papers. I flipped to the 3rd page of the verified bank document and pointed directly at the black ink on the signature line at the very bottom. I read the printed name out loud so every single person at the lavish party could hear it clearly. The name legally bound to the massive crushing debt was not Richard or Helen. The signature belonged entirely to Jamal. My father aggressively grabbed the paper from my hands, his eyes scanning the bottom of the page in sheer absolute horror. He began to shake violently as he demanded to know how his son-in-law could possibly take out a massive loan against a luxury property he did not even legally own. I did not look at Jamal when I answered that question. I looked directly at my mother, Helen. I clearly reminded her about a beautiful Sunday afternoon exactly 2 years ago. Jamal had brought over a large stack of documents claiming they were just standard routine tax forms he urgently needed them to sign to help with a minor corporate audit. I told my parents they were so incredibly eager to support their golden son-in-law that they did not even bother to read a single word of the fine print. I loudly announced to the shocked crowd that my parents had not signed a standard tax form that afternoon. They had unknowingly signed a comprehensive and binding financial power of attorney. They had legally handed Jamal the absolute unrestricted right to act completely on their behalf. He used that exact legal power to quietly leverage their entire luxury estate, completely drain the massive equity, and secretly fund his failing business ventures while they blindly praised his fake financial success. Jamal had not saved them from inflation. He had systematically robbed them blind right under their own roof and left them holding the empty bag. My father, Richard, stood frozen as the horrifying reality of my words finally crashed down on him. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He snatched the thick bank document from my hands and stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. His eyes darted wildly across the black ink, verifying that it was indeed Jamal's name, permanently tying their beloved home to massive crippling debt. The heavy silence on the patio was broken only by my mother, Helen, letting out a sharp, agonizing gasp. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the stone pavers, and she had to grab the edge of the outdoor kitchen counter just to keep herself from completely collapsing onto the ground. Richard suddenly crumpled the expensive bank paper in his fist and turned his furious gaze directly toward his golden son-in-law. The blind admiration he had shown just 5 minutes ago instantly morphed into raw, desperate panic. He marched right up to Jamal and grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive custom-tailored suit. He violently shook the much taller man, demanding to know if what I said was true. He screamed at Jamal, asking how he could possibly trick them into signing away their entire life savings under the disguise of a simple corporate tax audit. Jamal desperately tried to pry my father's shaking hands off his jacket, but Richard refused to let go. His voice cracked as he yelled that he had worked his entire life to build this estate, and now they were going to be thrown out onto the street like worthless garbage. Helen quickly rushed forward, tears now streaming down her perfectly applied makeup. She completely ignored me and grabbed her older daughter Audrey by the arm. She frantically begged Audrey to talk some sense into her husband. She cried out that they only had less than 24 hours before the county sheriff arrived to permanently padlock the front doors. She demanded to know how Audrey could just stand there and let her own parents lose absolutely everything they owned. Audrey nervously backed away from her mother, unable to make eye contact. But then a sudden spark of desperate hope flashed across my mother's terrified face. She wiped her wet cheeks and pointed directly at Jamal. She loudly reminded everyone on the patio about the massive celebration they were currently throwing. She practically screamed that Jamal had just successfully secured a massive $4 million capital investment today from his anonymous international partner. Helen aggressively grabbed Jamal's arm alongside my father and demanded that he instantly wire the necessary funds to the National Bank right this second to clear the secondary mortgage and stop the eviction process. Richard eagerly agreed, violently shaking Jamal again and ordering him to use his brilliant financial connections to pay off the entire debt immediately. He yelled that since he and Helen had always supported Jamal, it was his absolute duty to fix this massive mistake. They honestly believed the $4 million was their ultimate salvation. They stared at Jamal with wild, desperate eyes, fully expecting him to pull out his phone, call his offshore bank, and make the entire nightmare disappear with his newly acquired wealth. They felt completely entitled to that money. They had absolutely no idea that they were desperately begging a man who was already completely ruined by my trap. Jamal forcefully shoved my father's shaking hands off his expensive suit jacket. The violent push caused Richard to stumble backward, and he nearly fell onto the hard stone patio. The remaining wealthy party guests gasped in absolute shock, but absolutely nobody stepped forward to help him. Audrey, who had been completely silent until this very moment, finally stepped up to stand right beside her husband. The terrified, helpless expression on her face instantly vanished and was replaced by a cold, ruthless sneer. She looked down at her own parents with pure disgust, as if they were nothing more than common trash, ruining her perfect afternoon aesthetic. Helen reached out a trembling hand toward her golden child, still crying desperately and begging for the $4 million to save their family home. Audrey violently slapped her mother's hand away. She raised her voice so everyone left in the yard could hear her absolute contempt. She sharply told her mother to stop being so incredibly pathetic and embarrassing. She yelled that she and Jamal were absolutely not going to waste their massive new fortune on bailing out two foolish old people who did not even bother to read the financial documents they were signing. Richard stared at his favorite daughter in pure disbelief. He weakly reminded her that he had given her absolutely everything she ever wanted her entire life, and that she owed them her loyalty. Audrey let out a loud, wicked laugh that echoed across the quiet yard. She completely rejected his desperate plea. She aggressively pointed her manicured finger at his chest and told him that the $4 million belonged strictly to her and her husband. She explicitly declared that they were not going to give their parents a single cent to pay off the bank. She boasted that they were going to take their millions and buy a massive modern mansion in a much better neighborhood, far away from this depressing financial ruin. Jamal smoothed down his wrinkled lapels and nodded firmly in agreement with his cruel wife. He looked at my devastated parents with zero remorse. He coldly stated that high-level finance was a ruthless game, and they were just bad at playing it. He arrogantly explained that the suburban estate was already a sinking ship, and he was simply smart enough to extract the remaining equity before it completely went under. He actually blamed my parents for being so blindly trusting and deeply stupid. He told them that they should consider losing their house as a valuable educational lesson in modern economics. The sheer cruelty of their betrayal hung heavy in the warm afternoon air. My parents had spent their entire lives treating Audrey like a flawless royal princess and treating me like absolute garbage. Now, in their darkest hour of absolute need, their perfect golden child was happily throwing them completely under the bus just to protect her own wealth. Helen dropped to her knees on the hard stone patio, sobbing uncontrollably into her trembling hands. Richard stood completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the daughter who had just intentionally destroyed his entire life. They were completely broken, and Audrey did not care at all, not. As the brutal reality of Audrey and Jamal's betrayal finally sank in, my parents slowly turned their desperate eyes toward me. The golden child they had worshipped for decades had just thrown them to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. My mother Helen pushed herself up from the hard stone patio, her expensive designer dress now stained and wrinkled. Her tear-streaked face was a picture of absolute terror. She stumbled toward me and aggressively grabbed both of my hands. Her grip was painfully tight, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into my skin. My father Richard quickly followed her lead. He abandoned his aggressive and arrogant posture completely. His shoulders slumped and he looked like a broken, terrified old man. He reached out and placed his trembling hands over my mother's, gripping my arm, as if I were the absolute last life raft on a sinking ship. They both began to sob hysterically, apologizing for everything they had just said and done. Richard begged me to use my federal financial expertise to find a legal loophole to stop the immediate eviction. Helen cried out that I was their brilliant, successful daughter and pleaded with me to use my own savings to pay off the bank to buy them just a little more time. It was a truly pathetic display of hypocritical desperation. Just 10 minutes ago, they were viciously mocking my career and threatening to disown me forever. Now they were on their knees treating me like their ultimate savior. I looked down at their desperate, gripping hands. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sadness for them. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow closure. I forcefully yanked my arms backward, breaking their desperate grip. My sudden physical movement caused Helen to stumble forward again, but I did not reach out to catch her. I stood tall and looked directly down into my mother's terrified, weeping eyes. I kept my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotion as I repeated the exact words she had said to me just 3 days ago when I was bleeding in a hospital bed. I clearly told her that I simply did not have time to deal with her attention-seeking drama today. I sharply reminded her that Audrey was heavily focused on her corporate career and could not afford any negative distractions from her failing parents. Helen let out a choked gasp as her own toxic words were forcefully thrown right back into her face. Richard stared at me in stunned silence, finally realizing the absolute magnitude of their parental failure. I did not stop there. I coldly told them to deal with the county sheriff on their own tomorrow morning, take a taxi to a cheap motel whenever they were evicted, and make absolutely sure they did not bring their depressing energy to my doorstep. The devastating realization finally crushed them completely. They had spent their entire lives treating me like garbage, and now that they were ruined, I was leaving them exactly where they belonged. Jamal watched my parents completely break down on the patio, but he did not show a single ounce of sympathy. Instead, my cold reaction to their desperate pleading seemed to completely snap his remaining patience. He forcefully pushed his way past my weeping mother and stomped directly toward me. His face was flushed with a dark, furious red, and the veins in his thick neck were bulging visibly against his tight silk collar. He pointed a large, trembling finger right at my face and unleashed a loud, violent barrage of insults that echoed off the brick walls of the massive estate. He screamed that I was a bitter, jealous failure who was intentionally trying to ruin his flawless reputation because I could never achieve anything on my own. He yelled that I was a pathetic little nobody who would spend the rest of her miserable life rotting in a cheap apartment counting pennies for failing businesses. He laughed a loud, maniacal laugh that sounded completely unhinged to anyone listening. He loudly declared to the entire yard that I was absolutely powerless to stop him, and that my little federal tax threats meant absolutely nothing to a man of his incredible intellect and high social standing. He puffed out his chest and proudly boasted about the $4 million he had just stolen from my grandfather. He threw his arms wide open and arrogantly announced that the money was already completely gone from American soil. He explicitly bragged that he had personally wired every single penny directly into a highly secure offshore account located deep in the Cayman Islands. He looked around at the shocked party guests and confidently declared that the money was now entirely protected by international banking privacy laws and that absolutely no United States law enforcement agency could ever reach it. Jamal leaned in so close to my face that I could smell the stale champagne and bitter panic on his breath. He sneered down at me and aggressively stated that the federal government was too slow and too stupid to ever track his sophisticated digital footprints. He proudly called himself an untouchable financial mastermind and viciously called me a miserable bitch who was simply angry that she was too stupid to play the real corporate game. He claimed he was going to take his millions, take his beautiful wife, and leave this pathetic family to rot in their own massive financial ruin without looking back. He was practically foaming at the mouth, completely intoxicated by his own massive ego and his absolute certainty that he had committed the perfect crime. He stood there breathing heavily, towering over my injured body, expecting me to finally cower in fear and admit total defeat. He honestly thought his loud, aggressive voice and his offshore banking knowledge made him an invincible god among men. He had absolutely no idea that every single arrogant word he just screamed had dug his grave 10 feet deeper, and that his supposedly untouchable offshore account did not actually exist anywhere outside of my carefully orchestrated federal trap. I did not flinch or take a single step back as Jamal screamed his lungs out. I just stood there, letting his angry rants and pathetic insults wash over me. When he finally ran out of breath and stood there panting heavily under the afternoon sun, I simply reached into the side compartment of my leather tote bag. I did not pull out a tissue to wipe my bruised face, and I certainly did not pull out a phone to beg the police for help. I pulled out my sleek silver iPad. I completely ignored his furious glare and walked right past him, stepping through the open glass sliding doors that led from the outdoor patio directly into the massive living room. The wealthy guests and my terrified parents slowly followed behind me, drawn by the magnetic pull of the unfolding disaster. I stood in front of the massive 80-inch smart television mounted on the living room wall. With 3 quick, deliberate taps on my tablet screen, I wirelessly bypassed their local network and cast my display directly onto the giant television. The upbeat jazz music that had been playing through the house audio system instantly cut out. It was replaced by a sharp electronic chime that echoed through the dead silent room. The massive screen illuminated the living room with a bright, pale blue glow. It did not show a beautiful family photo slideshow or a brilliant financial investment portfolio. It displayed the highly classified secure remote monitoring dashboard of my forensic accounting software. I heard several sharp gasps from the crowd as complex lines of digital code and highly detailed transaction logs began scrolling rapidly across the television screen. Jamal pushed his way through the gathered crowd and stumbled into the living room. He looked up at the giant screen and his jaw practically unhinged. Right there in massive high-definition letters was the exact routing number, the precise timestamp, and the forged digital signature from the $4 million transaction he had executed just a few hours ago. The supposed offshore Cayman Islands account number he was just loudly bragging about was prominently displayed in the center of the screen, but it was flashing with a massive bright red warning banner. I slowly turned around and looked directly into his wide, terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly calm and completely conversational. I asked him a very simple question that carried the heavy weight of a death sentence. "Brother-in-law," I asked gently, "do you happen to know exactly how many years in a federal prison the mandatory penalty for international wire fraud carries?" Jamal opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping heavily into the expensive glass coffee table. He was finally beginning to understand that the pathetic little sister he had completely underestimated was not actually trapped in his game. He was trapped in mine, and the steel doors were just about to lock. Jamal stared at the massive television screen, unable to tear his eyes away from the flashing red warning banner. I walked over to the expensive glass coffee table he had just bumped into. I reached inside my coat pocket one last time. I did not pull out another bank statement or a foreclosure notice. I pulled out a solid black leather wallet and tossed it directly onto the clear glass surface right in front of him. The heavy thud made him flinch violently. The leather wallet flipped open on impact, revealing a gleaming gold shield and a highly secure federal identification card. Right next to it, I dropped my official certified fraud examiner credentials. I looked around the quiet living room, making sure my parents and Audrey were paying absolute attention to what was happening. I told them that for my entire adult life, they had endlessly mocked me for being a boring freelance bookkeeper. They had laughed at my career, calling me a glorified retail cashier who just counted pennies for failing businesses. I proudly announced to the entire room that my actual professional title was Senior Forensic Investigator for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I spent my long days hunting down sophisticated financial predators and dismantling illegal international money laundering rings for the federal government. I turned my cold gaze back to Jamal, who was now sweating so profusely that his expensive silk shirt was completely soaked. I told him that his supposed $4 million anonymous investment deal was absolutely nothing more than a desperate delusion. I revealed that he had actually been the primary target of a massive federal money laundering investigation for the past 6 solid months. My specialized department had been quietly monitoring every single one of his failing shell corporations, his desperate offshore transfers, and the massive secret debts he was furiously trying to hide from his wealthy country club friends. I explained that we knew he was completely financially bankrupt long before he ever threw this lavish party. We knew exactly how he had illegally leveraged my parents' massive colonial estate to keep his fake high society lifestyle afloat. But my federal prosecution team needed him to make one massive, undeniable mistake on American soil to guarantee a flawless criminal conviction. I calmly told him that stealing the encrypted flash drive containing my grandfather's trust fund was the exact bait we had intentionally set up for him. I knew his massive, arrogant ego and his extreme toxic greed would completely blind him to the obvious digital traps I had carefully woven into that device. Audrey let out a loud, hysterical sob and covered her mouth with both trembling hands. She finally realized that the brilliant, wealthy investment director she had flaunted for years was actually a completely broke federal criminal who was about to go to prison. My father, Richard, stared at the bright gold federal badge sitting on his glass coffee table, and then slowly looked up at me with a completely blank, shattered expression. The daughter he had just viciously cursed out and threatened to disown was actually a powerful federal agent who had just systematically dismantled their entire fake reality. Jamal slowly sank down onto the expensive white living room sofa, completely paralyzed and entirely defeated by the very person he had spent years treating like absolute garbage. Jamal sat completely frozen on the expensive white sofa, staring blankly at the massive television screen. His towering arrogance had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, trembling criminal. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, making sure my voice remained perfectly calm, but carried the absolute heavy weight of a federal death sentence. I decided it was finally time to explain the absolute magnitude of his own stupidity to him and his adoring audience. I told him that the encrypted flash drive Audrey had viciously stolen from my wrecked car that freezing night did not contain a single cent of real money. My grandfather's $4 million trust fund was heavily secured on an advanced biometric cloud server that a pathetic, arrogant amateur like him could never possibly reach. I clearly explained that the physical USB drive was nothing more than a carefully designed digital decoy. It was a highly malicious digital key that I had personally programmed to open a completely fake banking interface. When he confidently plugged that stolen drive into his personal computer and used his cheap illegal software to bypass my fake security walls, he officially locked himself inside a federal prison. The glowing $4 million he saw on his monitor was just a brilliant digital illusion. It was specifically designed to trigger his massive, endless greed and completely blind his professional judgment. He honestly believed he was brilliantly draining my legitimate inheritance to save his failing life and pay off his massive hidden corporate debts. I leaned in much closer to his sweating face and delivered the final devastating legal blow. I explained exactly what actually happened when he entered his hidden Cayman Islands routing numbers and happily clicked the final transfer button. I told him he did not touch a single penny of my protected money. Instead, my hidden spyware instantly reversed his entire financial protocol. The advanced system automatically bypassed his personal security and directly accessed all of his underground bank accounts. It rapidly gathered every single dollar of dirty money he had illegally collected from his various corporate scams over the past 2 years. But the absolute best part of my entire trap was the final destination of his funds. I loudly announced to the dead silent living room that instead of sending his money to his safe offshore island account, the system aggressively routed his entire illegal fortune directly into a frozen evidence account. That specific high-security account was entirely monitored and controlled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He did not successfully steal my inheritance today. He had just voluntarily handed every single piece of his money, laundering evidence straight to the United States government, wrapped in a perfect digital bow. I coldly reminded him that executing that massive illegal wire transfer right from his own home internet network created a permanent, undeniable digital footprint. By clicking that single arrogant button, he had officially convicted himself of severe federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The absolute minimum mandatory sentence for his specific combination of crimes was 15 long years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. My parents and Audrey stood completely paralyzed in the living room, hopelessly watching the total destruction of the wealthy man they had blindly worshipped. Their fake high society life was officially over, and I was the one who finally burned it all to the ground. Jamal tried to stand up from the expensive white sofa to defend himself, but his knees instantly buckled beneath his heavy weight. He crashed down hard onto the polished hardwood floor right next to the glass coffee table. The loud thud of his body hitting the ground echoed through the massive living room, but nobody moved a single muscle to help him. The confident posture and arrogant smirk he had worn just 10 minutes ago were entirely gone. He was trembling so violently that his custom-tailored suit jacket was visibly shaking against his body. He gasped for air as if the oxygen had been suddenly sucked completely out of the room. He was experiencing a full-blown panic attack as the terrifying reality of a 15-year federal prison sentence finally crushed his massive, fragile ego. I looked down at his pathetic state and decided to twist the knife just a little bit deeper into his shattered reality. I took a slow step forward and reminded him of the most basic rule of digital security that even a teenage amateur hacker should know. I told him that the absolute worst part of his brilliant master plan was not just the fact that he voluntarily sent his own dirty money to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The true nail in his legal coffin was the exact physical location he had so arrogantly chosen to execute the illegal wire transfer. I pointed a finger toward the ceiling and calmly stated that he had connected my decoy flash drive directly to his personal laptop while logged into this exact residential internet network. I explained that by clicking that final transfer button, he had permanently tied his massive financial crime to his own unique device hardware and my parents' exact home internet protocol address. The Federal Cybercrime Division did not even have to work hard to track his complicated international movements. He had practically gift-wrapped his precise physical coordinates and his personal device identification codes alongside a legally binding digital confession. There was absolutely no way his expensive lawyers could ever claim his computer was hacked remotely or that some mysterious anonymous partner had stolen his identity. The forensic system logs showed his exact digital fingerprints matching perfectly with his physical presence in this very house at the exact minute the massive illegal transaction was officially authorized. Jamal pressed his shaking hands against his pale face and let out a pathetic, whimpering sound that was entirely devoid of any human dignity. The brilliant investment director who had just proudly promised to buy my parents a luxury yacht was now reduced to a sobbing mess on their living room floor. He fully realized that he had single-handedly built his own federal prison cell and personally locked the heavy steel door from the inside. He had absolute undeniable proof of his own massive guilt, permanently recorded on multiple highly classified government servers. He was entirely trapped in an inescapable legal nightmare with absolutely zero chance of a plea deal and zero chance of ever seeing his stolen millions again. The heavy silence in the massive living room was suddenly shattered by a sharp, hysterical scream. It did not come from my mother or my father. It came from Audrey. She had been standing frozen near the edge of the expensive Persian rug, watching her wealthy husband completely break down on the hardwood floor. The sheer terror of a federal investigation and a 15-year prison sentence had finally breached her thick layer of arrogance. Her fierce loyalty to the man she had proudly flaunted for years vanished in an absolute instant. Her basic survival instinct violently kicked in, and she immediately decided to throw him directly into the fire to save her own perfect life. Audrey practically sprinted away from Jamal, treating him like he was suddenly infected with a highly contagious, deadly disease. She backed herself against the living room wall and pointed a shaking manicured finger at his collapsed body. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her elegant high society persona. She viciously demanded to know how he could possibly do something so incredibly stupid and reckless to her. She did not care that he was having a massive panic attack or that his life was entirely over. She only cared about how his federal crimes were going to completely destroy her flawless corporate reputation and her upcoming promotion to senior vice president. She looked frantically around the room, making intense eye contact with the remaining wealthy party guests and my terrified parents. She started aggressively rewriting history right then and there. Audrey loudly declared to everyone listening that she had absolutely no idea what Jamal was doing behind closed doors. She desperately claimed that she was completely blind to his illegal offshore accounts, his massive hidden debts, and his complex money laundering schemes. She practically choked on her own tears as she played the role of the tragic innocent victim who had been cruelly manipulated by a master criminal. She swore on her life that she thought his investment firm was entirely legitimate and successful. Then she turned her wild, desperate eyes directly toward me. The same sister who had just violently thrown a $10,000 bribe in my face and tried to force me into signing a fake drunk driving confession was now begging for my mercy. She aggressively pointed at Jamal and screamed that stealing the encrypted flash drive from my wrecked car was entirely his idea. She claimed he had emotionally abused her into doing it, and that she was only trying to be a supportive wife. She frantically pleaded with me to tell the federal agents that she was completely innocent and entirely uninvolved in his wire fraud. I stood perfectly still and watched the absolute destruction of their perfect marriage. Just minutes ago, they were an unstoppable power couple, ready to let me take the fall for a violent car crash they caused. Now they were viciously tearing each other apart, like wild animals trapped in a small cage. Audrey was fully prepared to let her husband rot in a maximum security federal prison if it meant she could walk away clean. She honestly thought her pathetic tears and fake victim routine would somehow erase her own massive crimes. But she was about to learn that my federal prosecution team had a very different plan for her. I watched Audrey desperately play the innocent victim, crying fake tears and pointing her manicured finger at her collapsed husband. She honestly believed that her pathetic performance would convince me to let her walk away completely untouched. She thought I was the same weak little sister who always took the blame for her massive mistakes. I did not yell at her or call her a liar. I simply turned my attention back to the sleek silver tablet resting in my hand. With one slow, deliberate swipe of my index finger, I completely bypassed the forensic accounting dashboard on the giant television screen. The complex lines of federal financial codes instantly vanished and were replaced by a pitch-black video player. I tapped the play button right in the center of my tablet. A loud high-definition audio recording suddenly blasted through the expensive living room speakers. It was the distinct sound of a heavy car engine roaring down a freezing highway, mixed with loud, slurred shouting. Everyone in the room turned their heads toward the giant 80-inch display as the crisp, wide-angle footage from my hidden dual-lens dashcam flooded the screen. My customized vehicle security system was programmed to automatically upload every single second of interior footage directly to my secure cloud server in absolute real time. The high-resolution video clearly showed the entire front cabin of my car from just 3 nights ago. The digital evidence was completely undeniable. Right there in front of her wealthy friends and our terrified parents was Audrey. She was visibly intoxicated, violently swaying in the passenger seat and aggressively screaming at me while I calmly tried to navigate the icy dark road. The living room went dead silent as they watched the digital version of my sister suddenly lunge across the center console. The camera caught the exact terrifying moment. Her hands viciously grabbed the steering wheel and violently jerked it to the right. The loud screech of tires and the brutal sound of crunching metal echoed through the house as the video showed our car violently crashing into the heavy concrete barrier. But the damning footage did not stop at the devastating crash. The wide-angle lens perfectly captured what happened immediately after the heavy airbags deployed. The video clearly showed me slumped over the steering wheel, completely unconscious and bleeding heavily from my forehead. Instead of calling for an ambulance or checking if her own blood sister was still breathing, Audrey quickly unbuckled her seatbelt. The high-definition camera recorded her aggressively digging through my dark winter coat pockets with absolute zero hesitation. The entire room watched in absolute horror as Audrey triumphantly pulled the encrypted flash drive from my pocket, sneered at my unconscious, bleeding body, and quickly climbed out of the wrecked vehicle, leaving me entirely alone to die in the freezing winter cold. I hit the pause button, freezing the giant television screen right on a crystal-clear high-definition close-up of Audrey holding the stolen flash drive with a wicked, selfish smirk on her face. I slowly turned around to face her. Her fake, innocent tears had instantly dried up, and her face was now a sickening shade of pale gray. She was physically trembling, pressing her back hard against the living room wall, as if she wanted to disappear completely into the drywall. I kept my voice perfectly even and loudly informed her that my federal prosecution team had already submitted this exact cloud footage to the State Highway Patrol. I calmly told my supposed innocent sister that aggravated vehicular assault, reckless endangerment, and leaving the scene of a nearly fatal accident carried a very mandatory and very lengthy state prison sentence. The giant television screen remained frozen on the high-definition image of Audrey holding the stolen flash drive. Jamal slowly lifted his heavy head from the hardwood floor. His bloodshot eyes shifted from the glowing digital evidence directly to his terrified wife. The paralyzing fear that had just crushed his ego suddenly morphed into a violent, boiling rage. He finally understood that he was not the one who originally brought the federal trap into their secure home. Audrey was the one who physically delivered the digital poison right to his personal laptop. Jamal pushed himself up from the floor, his expensive suit completely wrinkled, and his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. He took heavy stomping steps toward Audrey, who was still pressing her back against the living room wall in absolute shock. Before she could even open her mouth to defend herself, Jamal raised his large hand and slapped her violently across the face. The sharp cracking sound of his palm hitting her cheek echoed like a gunshot through the dead silent room. Audrey was thrown entirely off balance by the brutal force of the strike and crashed hard into a heavy wooden bookshelf, knocking expensive crystal vases onto the floor, where they shattered into a million sharp pieces. Jamal stood over her, screaming at the top of his lungs. He viciously blamed her for his entire federal downfall. He yelled that if she had just left me in the wrecked car without stealing my property, he would never have plugged that malicious drive into his secure network. He cursed her massive stupidity and called her a reckless, arrogant liability who just destroyed his entire perfect life. He completely forgot that he was the one who actually executed the illegal wire transfer because he desperately needed a convenient scapegoat, and his own wife was the perfect target. Audrey held her bright red cheek and stared up at her husband in absolute stunned silence. For a brief second, she looked like a helpless victim, but that pathetic illusion vanished instantly. Her initial shock quickly transformed into a wild feral fury. She let out a loud, piercing shriek that sounded more like an injured wild animal than a sophisticated corporate executive. She pushed herself up from the shattered glass, ignoring the sharp crystal pieces cutting into her expensive designer dress. Audrey lunged directly at Jamal with her hands raised like heavy claws. She aggressively aimed for his face and dragged her perfectly manicured nails deeply down his cheek, leaving 3 thick, bloody scratches across his skin. Jamal let out a loud yell of sudden pain and tried to grab her wrists, but Audrey was completely out of control. She violently kicked his shins and tore at the collar of his custom-tailored silk shirt, ripping the expensive fabric completely open. She screamed right back into his bleeding face, telling him that he was nothing but a pathetic broke loser who could not even afford his own luxury lifestyle without stealing from his wife's family. She viciously reminded him that he was the supposed global financial genius who completely failed to recognize a basic federal tracking program. She yelled that he was a massive fraud who eagerly used her stolen flash drive because he was entirely desperate and completely bankrupt long before the car crash ever happened. They aggressively wrestled each other, tumbling over the expensive white sofa and violently knocking over the glass coffee table. The polished living room turned into a chaotic physical fighting ring. They were viciously tearing each other apart physically and verbally, exposing every single dirty secret and toxic lie their fake marriage was built upon. While the 2 perfect golden children brutally attacked each other, my parents completely shattered into a million unfixable pieces. My mother Helen slowly slid down the living room wall until she was sitting flat on the cold hardwood floor. Her expensive party makeup was completely ruined by heavy streams of black mascara and dark, miserable tears. She pulled her trembling knees to her chest and began rocking back and forth, crying with a loud, pathetic wailing sound that made the remaining party guests incredibly uncomfortable. She kept weakly calling out their names, begging them to stop fighting, but her fragile voice was entirely drowned out by their violent screams and the loud sounds of breaking luxury furniture. My father Richard did not even try to intervene or pull his violent son-in-law off his precious daughter. He simply collapsed onto his knees right next to the shattered glass of the coffee table. He buried his pale face in his trembling hands and sobbed uncontrollably like a helpless, frightened child. He realized with absolute crushing certainty that his entire perfect world was permanently gone. His massive colonial estate was being heavily foreclosed and seized by the local bank tomorrow morning. His brilliant son-in-law was a broke federal criminal facing 15 years in a maximum security prison. His flawless corporate daughter was facing mandatory state prison time for aggravated vehicular assault and reckless endangerment. His entire high society reputation was instantly destroyed in front of his most important wealthy friends. The country club guests, who had been happily drinking his expensive champagne just 30 minutes ago, were now quietly backing out of the front door. Some of them were even holding up their expensive smartphones, secretly recording the absolute humiliating downfall of the arrogant family they used to blindly envy. I stood quietly near the giant television screen, with my arms comfortably crossed over my chest. I watched the absolute physical and emotional carnage unfold without showing a single shred of pity. My federal identification badge and my forensic credentials were still resting perfectly on the only piece of furniture that had not been flipped over during their violent brawl. The massive living room looked like the devastating aftermath of a brutal natural disaster. Expensive modern artwork was knocked off the walls, heavy designer lamps were completely smashed, and the perfectly arranged furniture was violently tossed aside. Jamal and Audrey were still rolling on the floor, aggressively scratching and punching each other while screaming the most vile, unforgivable insults they could possibly imagine. Helen and Richard were sitting in the middle of the absolute wreckage, sobbing loudly into the ruined fabric of their expensive party clothes. This was the exact family that had spent my entire life treating me like an invisible, worthless burden. They had happily celebrated my pain and viciously mocked my professional career to make themselves feel intellectually superior. They had brutally demanded that I accept a felony conviction just to protect their fake high society aesthetic. Now they were drowning in a massive ocean of their own toxic consequences, and there was absolutely nobody left to save them. The glorious $4 million celebration had officially transformed into a scene of absolute profound humiliation. I did not feel any sudden urge to forgive them or help them up from the messy floor. I did not feel any tragic family loyalty tugging at my heart. I simply watched them burn in the massive fire they had personally started, perfectly content with the beautiful, devastating justice I had finally delivered. The brutal fight on the living room floor suddenly came to a complete stop. It was not because my parents finally found the courage to intervene, or because Jamal and Audrey realized how pathetic they looked. The violent screaming and the sounds of shattering glass were abruptly swallowed by a much louder and far more terrifying noise. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the far distance, but it multiplied rapidly and echoed violently across the quiet suburban neighborhood. The distinct, deafening sound of multiple heavy police sirens tore through the warm afternoon air. The few wealthy guests who were still lingering on the outdoor patio completely froze in their tracks and stared wide-eyed toward the front of the massive estate. The heavy rumbling of armored tactical vehicles and standard police cruisers violently shook the pristine driveway. The loud screeching of heavy tires braking suddenly against the concrete signaled that the massive house was completely surrounded. Before anyone inside the wrecked living room could even take a single breath, intense flashing red and blue lights violently pierced through the large front windows. The bright strobe lights danced wildly across the shattered crystal on the floor and illuminated the terrified pale faces of my family. The beautiful colonial home that my parents had proudly showed off for decades was now the epicenter of a massive joint federal and state police raid. Jamal slowly released his tight grip on Audrey's torn dress and stumbled backward away from her. His bleeding face was a mask of absolute pure horror as the blinding police lights washed over his expensive, ruined suit. Audrey scrambled backward across the hardwood floor, ignoring the sharp glass cutting into her hands, until her back hit the solid wooden door of the front hallway. She pulled her knees to her chest and began shaking uncontrollably, realizing that the highway patrol had arrived to arrest her for the brutal car crash. Helen and Richard remained sitting in the middle of the ruined living room, completely paralyzed by the deafening sirens and the flashing lights. Their mouths hung open in absolute shock as heavy, synchronized footsteps stomped loudly onto their front porch. I calmly reached down and picked up my gold federal badge and my forensic credentials from the only surviving piece of furniture. I placed them carefully back into my dark winter coat pocket. I looked down at the four people who had made my entire existence an absolute living hell. They were completely cornered and entirely stripped of their fake wealth and massive egos. A loud, booming voice suddenly echoed through a police megaphone outside the front door, demanding that all occupants step away from the windows and surrender immediately. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or regret. I adjusted my heavy coat, looked directly at Jamal and Audrey, and calmly told them that their time was officially up. I turned my back on my completely ruined family and walked slowly toward the front door, ready to let the federal agents finish exactly what I had started. I did not even have to turn the brass handle of the front door. Before my hand could reach the lock, a massive metal battering ram smashed violently through the thick reinforced wood. The expensive custom door splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces, flying across the marble entryway. A highly coordinated tactical team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured into the house like a dark, unstoppable wave. They were dressed in heavy black body armor, carrying matte black tactical rifles, and moving with terrifying military precision. Right behind them were several uniformed officers from the State Highway Patrol, their hands resting firmly on their holstered weapons. The sheer physical force of their entry completely shattered whatever tiny, fragile illusion of safety my family still possessed. The tactical agents fanned out across the massive living room, shouting clear, aggressive commands that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. They ordered everyone to get down on the hardwood floor and keep their hands where they could be seen. The few remaining country club friends, who had not already fled to their cars, dropped immediately to the patio stones outside, pressing their wealthy faces against the cold dirt. My mother Helen and my father Richard did not need to be told twice. They were already huddled together in the ruins of their shattered glass coffee table, trembling violently and covering their heads as if a bomb had just detonated inside their perfect suburban castle. I calmly stepped to the side of the entryway, keeping my hands completely visible and casually flashing my gold federal identification badge to the lead tactical agent as he rushed past me. He gave me a single sharp nod of professional recognition and immediately turned his aggressive focus toward the two massive criminals cowering in the center of the room. Jamal was still kneeling on the floor near the ruined white sofa, bleeding from the deep scratches his wife had just carved into his face. When the heavily armed federal agents surrounded him, his survival instinct completely short-circuited. Instead of complying with their loud verbal commands, he panicked and foolishly tried to push himself up to his feet. He raised his shaking hands and frantically tried to use his sophisticated financial vocabulary to explain himself. He stammered that there was a massive misunderstanding and that he was a highly respected global investment director. The tactical agents did not care about his custom-tailored silk shirt or his supposed high society status. Two massive agents instantly grabbed him by the shoulders and violently forced him face down onto the expensive Persian rug. Jamal let out a loud, breathless grunt as the heavy weight of the federal agents pinned him completely to the floor. One agent forcefully yanked his arms behind his back, crossing his wrists with a brutal efficiency. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely into place sounded like music to my ears. A senior federal investigator wearing a dark windbreaker stepped forward and looked down at Jamal with absolute disgust. In a loud, booming voice, the investigator formally identified himself and officially placed Jamal under federal arrest. He did not rush through the legal protocol. He methodically read Jamal his Miranda rights, ensuring every single word echoed clearly through the ruined living room. He explicitly stated that Jamal had the right to remain silent, and that anything he said could and would be used against him in a federal court of law. He listed the exact devastating charges, including multiple counts of international wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and complex money laundering. Jamal pressed his bleeding face into the rug, sobbing uncontrollably as the cold steel cut into his wrists. His massive $4 million ego had been permanently crushed under the boots of the United States government. While Jamal was being brutally secured on the floor, the uniformed officers from the State Highway Patrol aggressively moved toward Audrey. She was still backed completely into the corner of the room, shivering violently in her torn designer dress. When she saw the state troopers approaching her, with heavy steel handcuffs dangling from their belts, her fake innocent victim persona completely shattered. She frantically held up her perfectly manicured hands and began aggressively backing away from them. She screamed that they were making a terrible mistake and proudly announced that she was an elite corporate executive who had absolutely nothing to do with her husband's illegal offshore banking schemes. She pointed a trembling finger at Jamal and desperately tried to tell the officers to take him away and leave her alone. The lead highway patrol officer did not even blink at her pathetic high society demands. He grabbed her aggressively by the upper arm and spun her forcefully around, pinning her chest against the polished wooden wall. Audrey shrieked in absolute terror as the officer aggressively twisted her arms behind her back. He loudly informed her that she was not being arrested for federal wire fraud. He clearly stated that she was being taken into state custody for severe aggravated vehicular assault, reckless endangerment, and fleeing the scene of a nearly fatal highway accident. He completely ignored her loud, hysterical sobbing as he tightly secured the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. He leaned in close and firmly told her that they already had the high-definition cloud footage of her violently grabbing the steering wheel and actively stealing from an unconscious victim. Audrey kicked her expensive designer shoes against the baseboards, fighting like a spoiled toddler throwing a massive temper tantrum. She yelled that she was rich and that she would personally sue the entire police department for ruining her flawless reputation. Her threats were completely empty and entirely pathetic. The state troopers simply tightened their physical grip on her arms and forcefully pulled her away from the wall. The coordinated police units began physically dragging my completely ruined sister and brother-in-law out of the shattered living room. Jamal could barely walk on his own. His legs were completely numb from raw panic, and the federal agents practically had to carry his dead weight across the hardwood floor. He kept his head down, refusing to make eye contact with my weeping parents or the shocked party guests watching from the front lawn. He was taking the absolute ultimate walk of shame, permanently leaving behind the luxurious suburban life he had violently stolen from my family. Audrey, however, refused to go quietly into the night. She fought the state troopers with every single ounce of strength she had left, twisting and thrashing her body violently. As they dragged her forcefully through the splintered front doorway, her wild, desperate eyes suddenly locked directly onto mine. I was standing calmly near the entryway, perfectly untouched by the massive chaos surrounding me. Audrey stopped screaming at the police officers and started screaming my name. Her voice was completely raw and dripping with absolute terrifying desperation. She violently pulled against the steel handcuffs and begged me to use my federal authority to stop them. She cried out that we were blood sisters and that I could not possibly let her rot in a dirty state prison cell. She pleaded with me to tell the officers that the car crash was just a horrible accident and that she was truly sorry for leaving me to bleed in the freezing cold. She aggressively promised to give me back every single penny of my inheritance and buy me a brand new car if I would just make a single phone call to save her. I did not move a single inch. I did not offer her a warm, comforting smile or a forgiving nod. I simply stared at her with perfectly cold, dead eyes as the state troopers aggressively shoved her out the front door and down the concrete steps. Her hysterical screaming faded into the distance as they forcefully pushed her into the back of a heavily armored police cruiser and violently slammed the metal door shut, permanently silencing her toxic manipulation. I stood in the massive entryway and watched the red and blue police lights reflect off the shattered glass on the living room floor. The lead federal investigator who had read Jamal his rights slowly walked over and stood right beside me. He was a tall, imposing man with decades of criminal investigation experience. He looked around the completely ruined living room and then looked directly at me. He gave me a firm professional nod and quietly congratulated me on executing an absolutely flawless undercover sting operation. He confirmed that their cyber division had successfully frozen the entire $4 million transfer and permanently secured all of the money laundering evidence Jamal had so willingly provided. I thanked him for his excellent tactical coordination and shook his hand firmly. As the federal agents began clearing out of the house to properly secure the massive crime scene, I slowly turned around to look at my parents one final time. Helen and Richard were still sitting exactly where they had collapsed completely, surrounded by the broken pieces of their fake high society life. They did not even try to look up at me. They were entirely broken, stripped of their favorite golden children, and facing complete financial ruin. Tomorrow morning, the bank would arrive to formally evict them and permanently padlock the front doors. They would have absolutely nowhere to go, and nobody left to blindly worship. They had spent my entire life treating me like an embarrassing failure and choosing to protect the toxic criminals who ultimately destroyed them. I did not say a single word of goodbye. I did not offer them any money or a place to stay. I simply turned my back on the massive colonial estate, zipped up my dark winter coat, and walked out the shattered front door into the cool evening air. I had successfully reclaimed my inheritance, exposed their massive lies, and delivered absolute flawless justice. The game was officially over, and I had won. I did not even have to turn the brass handle of the front door. Before my hand could reach the lock, a massive metal battering ram smashed violently through the thick reinforced wood. The expensive custom door splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces, flying across the marble entryway. A highly coordinated tactical team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured into the house like a dark, unstoppable wave. They were dressed in heavy black body armor, carrying matte black tactical rifles, and moving with terrifying military precision. Right behind them were several uniformed officers from the State Highway Patrol, their hands resting firmly on their holstered weapons. The sheer physical force of their entry completely shattered whatever tiny, fragile illusion of safety my family still possessed. The tactical agents fanned out across the massive living room, shouting clear, aggressive commands that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. They ordered everyone to get down on the hardwood floor and keep their hands where they could be seen. The few remaining country club friends who had not already fled to their cars dropped immediately to the patio stones outside, pressing their wealthy faces against the cold dirt. My mother Helen and my father Richard did not need to be told twice. They were already huddled together in the ruins of their shattered glass coffee table, trembling violently and covering their heads as if a bomb had just detonated inside their perfect suburban castle. I calmly stepped to the side of the entryway, keeping my hands completely visible and casually flashing my gold federal identification badge to the lead tactical agent as he rushed past me. He gave me a single sharp nod of professional recognition and immediately turned his aggressive focus toward the two massive criminals cowering in the center of the room. Jamal was still kneeling on the floor near the ruined white sofa, bleeding from the deep scratches his wife had just carved into his face. When the heavily armed federal agents surrounded him, his survival instinct completely short-circuited. Instead of complying with their loud verbal commands, he panicked and foolishly tried to push himself up to his feet. He raised his shaking hands and frantically tried to use his sophisticated financial vocabulary to explain himself. He stammered that there was a massive misunderstanding and that he was a highly respected global investment director. The tactical agents did not care about his custom-tailored silk shirt or his supposed high society status. Two massive agents instantly grabbed him by the shoulders and violently forced him face down onto the expensive Persian rug. Jamal let out a loud, breathless grunt as the heavy weight of the federal agents pinned him completely to the floor. One agent forcefully yanked his arms behind his back, crossing his wrists with a brutal efficiency. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely into place sounded like music to my ears. A senior federal investigator wearing a dark windbreaker stepped forward and looked down at Jamal with absolute disgust. In a loud, booming voice, the investigator formally identified himself and officially placed Jamal under federal arrest. He did not rush through the legal protocol. He methodically read Jamal his Miranda rights, ensuring every single word echoed clearly through the ruined living room. He explicitly stated that Jamal had the right to remain silent and that anything he said could and would be used against him in a federal court of law. He listed the exact devastating charges, including multiple counts of international wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and complex money laundering. Jamal pressed his bleeding face into the rug, sobbing uncontrollably as the cold steel cut into his wrists. His massive $4 million ego had been permanently crushed under the boots of the United States government. While Jamal was being brutally secured on the floor, the uniformed officers from the State Highway Patrol aggressively moved toward Audrey. She was still backed completely into the corner of the room, shivering violently in her torn designer dress. When she saw the state troopers approaching her with heavy steel handcuffs dangling from their belts, her fake innocent victim persona completely shattered. She frantically held up her perfectly manicured hands and began aggressively backing away from them. She screamed that they were making a terrible mistake and proudly announced that she was an elite corporate executive who had absolutely nothing to do with her husband's illegal offshore banking schemes. She pointed a trembling finger at Jamal and desperately tried to tell the officers to take him away and leave her alone. The lead highway patrol officer did not even blink at her pathetic high society demands. He grabbed her aggressively by the upper arm and spun her forcefully around, pinning her chest against the polished wooden wall. Audrey shrieked in absolute terror as the officer aggressively twisted her arms behind her back. He loudly informed her that she was not being arrested for federal wire fraud. He clearly stated that she was being taken into state custody for severe aggravated vehicular assault, reckless endangerment, and fleeing the scene of a nearly fatal highway accident. He completely ignored her loud, hysterical sobbing as he tightly secured the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. He leaned in close and firmly told her that they already had the high-definition cloud footage of her violently grabbing the steering wheel and actively stealing from an unconscious victim. Audrey kicked her expensive designer shoes against the baseboards, fighting like a spoiled toddler throwing a massive temper tantrum. She yelled that she was rich and that she would personally sue the entire police department for ruining her flawless reputation. Her threats were completely empty and entirely pathetic. The state troopers simply tightened their physical grip on her arms and forcefully pulled her away from the wall. The coordinated police units began physically dragging my completely ruined sister and brother-in-law out of the shattered living room. Jamal could barely walk on his own. His legs were completely numb from raw panic, and the federal agents practically had to carry his dead weight across the hardwood floor. He kept his head down, refusing to make eye contact with my weeping parents or the shocked party guests watching from the front lawn. He was taking the absolute ultimate walk of shame, permanently leaving behind the luxurious suburban life he had violently stolen from my family. Audrey, however, refused to go quietly into the night. She fought the state troopers with every single ounce of strength she had left, twisting and thrashing her body violently. As they dragged her forcefully through the splintered front doorway, her wild, desperate eyes suddenly locked directly onto mine. I was standing calmly near the entryway, perfectly untouched by the massive chaos surrounding me. Audrey stopped screaming at the police officers and started screaming my name. Her voice was completely raw and dripping with absolute terrifying desperation. She violently pulled against the steel handcuffs and begged me to use my federal authority to stop them. She cried out that we were blood sisters and that I could not possibly let her rot in a dirty state prison cell. She pleaded with me to tell the officers that the car crash was just a horrible accident and that she was truly sorry for leaving me to bleed in the freezing cold. She aggressively promised to give me back every single penny of my inheritance and buy me a brand new car if I would just make a single phone call to save her. I did not move a single inch. I did not offer her a warm, comforting smile or a forgiving nod. I simply stared at her with perfectly cold, dead eyes as the state troopers aggressively shoved her out the front door and down the concrete steps. Her hysterical screaming faded into the distance as they forcefully pushed her into the back of a heavily armored police cruiser and violently slammed the metal door shut permanently, silencing her toxic manipulation. I stood in the massive entryway and watched the red and blue police lights reflect off the shattered glass on the living room floor. The lead federal investigator who had read Jamal his rights slowly walked over and stood right beside me. He was a tall, imposing man with decades of criminal investigation experience. He looked around the completely ruined living room and then looked directly at me. He gave me a firm professional nod and quietly congratulated me on executing an absolutely flawless undercover sting operation. He confirmed that their cyber division had successfully frozen the entire $4 million transfer and permanently secured all of the money laundering evidence Jamal had so willingly provided. I thanked him for his excellent tactical coordination and shook his hand firmly. As the federal agents began clearing out of the house to properly secure the massive crime scene, I slowly turned around to look at my parents one final time. Helen and Richard were still sitting exactly where they had collapsed, completely surrounded by the broken pieces of their fake high society life. They did not even try to look up at me. They were entirely broken, stripped of their favorite golden children, and facing complete financial ruin. Tomorrow morning, the bank would arrive to formally evict them and permanently padlock the front doors. They would have absolutely nowhere to go and nobody left to blindly worship. They had spent my entire life treating me like an embarrassing failure and choosing to protect the toxic criminals who ultimately destroyed them. I did not say a single word of goodbye. I did not offer them any money or a place to stay. I simply turned my back on the massive colonial estate, zipped up my dark winter coat, and walked out the shattered front door into the cool evening air. I had successfully reclaimed my inheritance, exposed their massive lies, and delivered absolute flawless justice. The game was officially over, and I had won. I dismissed the agency driver and slid directly into the driver's seat of the sleek black sedan that had been brought to the scene for me. My fractured rib gave a sharp throb as I reached for the heavy leather steering wheel, but the physical pain was completely overshadowed by the massive wave of absolute relief washing over my entire body. I pressed the ignition button, and the powerful engine roared to life with a deep, satisfying hum. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the dark curb without taking a single second to look back at the foreclosed colonial estate. I did not check my rearview mirror to see if my parents were still kneeling on the cold concrete driveway. They were officially ghosts to me now, permanently trapped in a tragic financial nightmare of their own making. I navigated the winding suburban streets, leaving the flashing red and blue police lights far behind me in the wealthy neighborhood. The loud, chaotic noise of the tactical raid and my parents' desperate weeping quickly faded away, replaced entirely by the quiet, soothing air conditioning of my new vehicle. I merged smoothly onto the main interstate highway, pointing the hood of my car directly toward the towering skyline of downtown Chicago. The heavy winter clouds had finally started to break apart, revealing a breathtaking evening sky. The setting sun was casting brilliant shades of deep crimson and bright burnt orange across the horizon, reflecting beautifully off the massive glass skyscrapers in the distance. I rested my right hand on the center console and took my first truly deep breath in what felt like a lifetime. The $4 million trust fund my grandfather had left me was perfectly safe and entirely secure. It was currently sitting in a heavily protected federal holding account, waiting to be legally transferred right back to my name the exact second Jamal and Audrey were officially convicted in a court of law. They had arrogantly tried to use my inheritance to fund their massive criminal lifestyle, and instead, they had blindly funded their own spectacular destruction. The flawless golden children were now nothing more than federal inmates, and the parents who enabled them were completely homeless and entirely forgotten. The golden hour sunlight warmed the cold interior of my car and illuminated the medical bandages still wrapped securely around my forehead. The physical scars from that freezing night on the highway would eventually fade, and the broken bones would fully heal. But the profound lesson I had taught my toxic family today would last for the rest of their miserable lives. They had spent decades treating me like a helpless, invisible scapegoat, constantly underestimating my intelligence and completely ignoring my worth. They honestly believed I was just a weak little lamb waiting to be slaughtered for their financial benefit. As I drove straight into the beautiful Chicago sunset, a quiet, confident smile finally broke across my face. I was never the lamb. I was the federal wolf waiting patiently in the dark, and I had just completely devoured their entire world. The most profound lesson to take away from this intense story is that a life constructed entirely on deception, extreme arrogance, and the mistreatment of others is simply a fragile house of cards waiting to completely collapse. Nora's family was entirely consumed by the toxic illusion of high society status. They blindly worshipped the shiny, expensive exterior of Jamal and Audrey, while viciously tearing down the one person who actually lived with genuine integrity. They foolishly believed that stolen wealth and fake corporate titles made them completely untouchable, treating basic kindness as a massive weakness and honesty as a pathetic character flaw. However, the absolute truth always finds a way to violently surface. Toxic greed is an incredibly blinding force. It made Jamal arrogant and reckless enough to steal directly from a highly trained federal investigator, and it made Richard and Helen foolish enough to legally sign away their beloved estate without reading a single word of the fine print. When you prioritize a fake aesthetic over real moral character, you actively invite your own devastating destruction. Furthermore, this story powerfully teaches us to never underestimate the quiet ones in the room. Nora endured years of severe emotional abuse and endless dismissal, yet she brilliantly used their massive, blinding arrogance as the exact weapon to permanently dismantle their fake empire. She did not need to scream or throw violent temper tantrums to win. She simply stepped aside and let their own horrible choices trap them. Genuine power does not come from stolen millions or a fabricated social status. True power comes from competence, incredible patience, and unwavering integrity. If you enjoyed this satisfying story of absolute flawless justice, hit that subscribe button to hear more thrilling tales of karma catching up to those who deserve it most.